We've looked at the impact of the coronavirus on income inequality, and now we're going to look at the impact on a few other important themes from our course. From a social upheaval perspective, coronavirus is having a significant impact on migration. One thing that's kind of interesting is that the virus has brought migration into the United States to a halt much more quickly and effectively than any border wall ever could have. I was reading the account of one migrant who was all ready to leave Honduras on her journey to the US when, boom, the border closed. She said she would never have believed that something like the pandemic could have happened. She'd been worried about maybe a hurricane or something, but a pandemic never entered her mind. Not only are fewer migrants now leaving their home countries, but those stuck in camps are having a terrible time. Many shelters and hotels that previously housed or helped migrants have closed. One aid center I was reading about in Colombia that normally feeds something like 4,500 Venezuelans every day has closed due to the virus. So where do those 4,500 people go and what do they do? Camps are too crowded for social distancing, and an outbreak in a camp hasn't happened yet, but if it did, it could be devastating. Deportation flights returning migrants to their homes are still going on in some cases, and they have potential to continue to spread the virus. Post-virus, though, a fresh surge in migration seems likely, as there will be lots of pent-up demand, and as economic conditions deteriorate, especially in developing countries, there will be a flight probably to the global north for better opportunity. The global political situation could also be negatively impacted by the virus. If we look all the way back to the time of the Black Death, it ushered in a period of political and social upheaval across Europe. Countries with weak political institutions, like many in Africa, which tend to have limited, if any, succession plans, may fall into complete chaos if one of their leaders should happen to die from the virus. As countries, and here both the United States and China come to mind, play the blame game, cooperative global governance seems unfortunately kind of unlikely. Most countries are going to need some strong leadership post-virus, as they're going to have heavy sovereign debt burdens, and they'll most likely be in a recession. There's also the possibility of food prices rising, which often leads to both social and political unrest, especially in developing countries. Significant cracks are showing up in the EU because of the virus. Most of the EU response was kind of late and after the fact, and each nation sort of responded as an individual nation. It will be interesting to see if the EU can survive the coronavirus. Like Greece before it, Italy's monetary hands are going to be tied by its inclusion in the Eurozone, and it's been so hard hit, it's going to need some aggressive monetary action to help it recover. There's definitely some risk there. Some EU countries slammed their borders closed. Hungary comes to mind. Even though they're part of the Schengen visa area and they committed to the open transport of goods, they haven't been actually willing to make that happen. Okay, so here's your third lecture assignment question. A pretty easy one, I hope. So pause here for a moment and figure out the right answer. So now we turn our attention to the potential impact of the virus on global trade. According to the World Trade Organization, trade is projected to drop between 13 and 32%. This far exceeds the drop in the Great Recession. We learned in earlier classes that the growth rate of merchandise trade had already slowed, and we can see that in the dotted blue line, which shows the trajectory of merchandise trade before the global financial crisis. The solid blue line shows the dip for the global financial crisis, followed by a much slower increase. Trade never returned to its pre-recession pace. And then we go along and we fall off the coronavirus cliff. In green, we have the optimistic scenario of the so-called V-shaped recession and recovery, where the economy returns to pre-COVID-19 levels fairly quickly. The red scenario shows trade levels coming back much slower and significantly lower than their pre-coronavirus levels. So why might that happen? For one, we as both businesses and consumers can't know, at least not yet, if this was a one-time shock or if there might be a recurrence or a series of mini resurgences. And as I've mentioned before in this class, we don't like uncertainty. It makes us and businesses cautious with our money, so we don't spend and businesses don't invest, which would lead to a much slower recovery with trade levels not necessarily ever getting back to their pre-coronavirus levels, which were already lower than the pre-global financial crisis lower levels. One of the biggest impacts on trade is in supply chain disruption. While we see immediate impact on the empty shelves in our grocery stores, products with complex supply chains, like electronics and automobiles, are much more likely to be heavily impacted over time, and those areas employ a lot of people and bring a lot of value to our economies. Managing supply chain disruptions can be hugely challenging and expensive for companies. This whole incident may force a serious restructuring of global supply chains. We've made the point a few times already, and this was brought up in the YouTube you watched this week, but trade had already turned down at the end of 2019. This reflects trade tensions mainly between the US and China. Export and import volumes were already on their way down, but the coronavirus will make this trend dramatically worse. Deglobalization refers to the idea of becoming less interdependent. Whenever I ask this question to the class, you all pretty much assure me that this isn't going to happen. You seem to like the genie's out of the bottle kind of idea that we're not going to unglobalize now that we are globalized. But we know that some deglobalization was already happening. Remember technology allowing companies to tap into inexpensive programmers without anyone having to move? Remember how the hearing aid manufacturers were able to shorten their supply chains through 3D printing? 80% of multinationals surveyed by Bank of America recently told them that they were considering reshoring, which means moving back at least part of their supply chains, if not back to the United States in our case, but at least back regionally, maybe to Mexico. But one area that has received a boost from the whole coronavirus and deglobalization movement is digitization. Think about it, drones. If drones can do the delivery or robots can help you in the hospital, or we're all getting pretty used to teleworking, maybe we should rename deglobalization something like digiglobalization. And I think the longer the crisis continues, the more different globalization will look when it resumes, when and if it resumes in some way, shape, or form. The blame game seems to be in full swing, with the US blaming China for the virus and China blaming the US for the virus, and conspiracy theories running rampant. I hope that you are not paying any attention to those and are being good, critical consumers of the news. racism is raising its ugly head in many nations. And we're doing our share to propagate that, which is pretty shameful. So please don't get sucked into that. Peter Navarro, an economic advisor to President Trump, he's doing something different. He's blaming corporations. And this is actually pretty interesting and ties into our course. Early in the course, we talked about the globalization of markets and Ted Levitt and the globalization of production. You'll recall that the globalization of production refers to the idea that MNEs move production around the globe to take advantage of location advantages. But in the process, we've given up our ability and capacity to make things ourselves. So when we have a crisis and each country goes into self-protection mode, putting up trade barriers like export restraints, we have a problem. Navarro states, it's the globalization of production through multinational corporations who salute no flag, who love cheap sweatshop labor, and who love the massive subsidies that the Chinese government throws at production to bring it from here to there, he said. And, clearly there's some truth to that. The MNEs, we've talked about, salute no flag, and that makes them hard to govern and hard to control. They love cheap sweatshop labor. Well, I'm not quite sure if they're the only ones who love that, because we can't really just blame the MNEs for the level of offshoring we've done. If we can make it at home in the US for $1 or buy it from China for 50 cents, most companies would buy it from China for 50 cents. That's all about global efficiency. That's all about specialization. That's all about maximizing shareholder value. And MNEs are not doing this alone. Consumers are definitely the co-conspirators. We too love to shop at Walmart and pay those low prices, or love to buy stuff on Amazon that's shipped and made from wherever. The hospitals who are buying masks and drugs from China were all about keeping their costs too. We're all about keeping their costs down too. So I think again, it's this trio of government, consumers, and businesses who need to work together to figure out some solutions to these kinds of problems. And that takes us to your final lecture assignment. I've given you links to 2 articles. I'd like you to read them and then come up with your own argument, well supported from these articles, about the impact of the coronavirus on the globalization/deglobalization question. Remember that the coronavirus is a unique situation. It provides a human shock, a supply-side shock, a demand-side shock, and a probable financial crisis. 4 shocks in one. So it will be interesting to see what the long-term effects will play out to be. Thanks very much.